Amen.
So John, first tell me about your family. Are you married? Do you have kids? You're living in St. Louis, but tell us about your family and then where you're working.
Yeah, thanks, and thanks for having me and showing up to talk for a bit. My wife and I moved to St. Louis about 10 years ago for my job at Washington University, and we now have 3 kids, 2 before we got there, and the third born in St. Louis. Lauren's 15, Hannah's 13, and Sam is 9, and they're at the stage when everyone can do their own logistics, and it's a good time of life.
But a very busy, active time
It is active,
of life.
yeah.
Yeah, very exciting. And then before you became a professor, you even worked in some churches as a youth guy or something. What is your faith journey a little bit? What did you grow up in, and where are you now?
Yeah, I was a little bit circuitous. I was a military brat, so we moved around every 2 or 3 years, and it was whatever church was near the base.
Yes.
Confirmed PC USA in 7th grade in Hawaii, and then sort of stuck in that denomination for a number of years. Went to college at Duke and was part of a church near Duke's campus, and then along the way was also getting involved in youth ministry. So volunteering with youth ministry, was involved in Young Life for a while during law school, and then jumped onto a church staff for a few years when I was in graduate school, directing the high school youth ministry. And so if we get there, I've got lots of thoughts about youth ministry today that we could talk about now that I'm not in the job. And but trying always to be figuring out at what age and stage we were, how do we involve and invest in the life of the church and be part of ministry as we're going along.
Right. And you're doing the baccalaureate this afternoon at Kincaid, and then you're going to be at the Racket Club tonight to talk to different lawyers around the city to try to get something going about senior lawyers mentoring younger lawyers in how to incorporate their faith into their practice.
Yeah, I love it. I was not expecting the promo, but here, this is great. So thanks. Yeah, so working with Nikki Pelop and some others in the Houston area, the vision here is, can we enter into a time of legal practice, sort of 2 to 5 years into the job, where young lawyers, a few years out of law school, now have all these questions and no time to answer them and no resources to go to. And so can we connect in a very smart and efficient way senior mentors to be with them, to help guide them along the process, give them some theological content, but also, and very importantly, I think, to do so in a way that is specifically nonpartisan, specifically multi-ethnic, that's focused on discipleship and formation of Christian lawyers and not some other side project. So that's the vision for tonight, and we have this in 7 regions around the country, and along the way discerned that Houston should be one of them. So that brings us here.
And Chris and Josie and Nikki and Stuart, you were together with at Duke in your undergraduate, and because they helped bring you to the baccalaureate, they said, how about you come to your church, their church, to help us on Sunday school.
Yeah, this has been awesome. We got together last night, and it's been fun to catch up and realize we were all once 18 together.
And is there any insider information that we can use as blackmail on any of those down the road? Or are you sworn to secrecy because they can do the same for you?
No, it's one way, and I've got lots, so we'll talk later.
Okay. Final shallow end of the pool. You're in St. Louis right now. Royals fan or Cardinals fan?
Oh, that's easy. Duke.
Duke fan? Okay, it's always Duke, isn't it? It comes back. Bass Pro, how many times have you been there? And down to Branson, how many shows have you gone to?
Yeah, I think Missouri's, as you know, right, very, very differentiated. I've not spent a lot of time in Branson, and it's quite, I've been to, my Bass Pro Shop experience is pretty limited.
It's been pretty limited. John has 3 books. I've read in the last week 2 of them. The first is Confident Pluralism, Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Difference. And then with Tim Keller, they edited a book called Uncommon Ground, Living Faithfully in a World of Difference. I commend both of them to you. This one's more like a political science textbook, but the last third really does case studies and gets practical for individuals and for families. And this one has several chapters by several authors that is really accessible. It's cookies on the lower shelf, but by scholars that are deeply formed, both either politically or legally or spiritually. And so these will be very good. In this book, John, you say that right now in our country's challenge. We're deeply divided, deeply polarized, that we need three things. We need tolerance, we need humility, we need patience. Can you explain those three, why you came up with those three, what those three mean? Just to get
Thanks.
kind of in.
And maybe the backdrop to that is we have to begin with the recognition that these deep differences we have are about things that really matter, and they're not going away. So there's no kumbaya solution to our current political moment. There never has been, but I think it's becoming clearer to a lot of people that the people in your neighborhoods and in your workplaces and in your schools, they're still going to be there, and there are going to be these fundamental disagreements over things like, what's the purpose of the country? What is a human being? Is there a God? And those raise massive questions that create massive relational challenges. And so one of the ideas that I'm proposing in Confident Pluralism is, can we assume postures toward others that can better help us find common ground and be in relationship with them? And I should say, in this first book, I wrote it really with the audience of the world in mind. So not that the world bought it, but the hope was, it's not a Christian book. It makes an argument rooted in American history and American law, and you buy it or you don't buy it based on whether I'm persuasive about that account of American history. But as I was writing it, I was thinking these ideas are also very applicable for Christians, and nothing that I'm saying here is inconsistent with how we as Christians are called to live in the world. So with humility, patience, and tolerance, just briefly on each of those. Humility, the idea that even though we might be firmly convinced about the truth of our beliefs or claims, we might not always be able to persuade someone else why we're right and they're wrong. So there's a kind of modesty to saying, it doesn't mean we're wrong, but it means there's going to be a disconnect. And sometimes the disconnect is not because this person is uneducated or less than us, but it might be that person has been raised and formed in a world that is so antithetical to where we were that there's this gap between our ability to relate to each other. And so the recognition that we're not always going to be able to prove or win the argument, and a related openness that we might be wrong about something, and that we should go into conversations at least listening to what the other person's going to say. And I think a lot of Christians, when they get in apologetic mode, want to just tell, and people today want conversations, not monologues. So that's humility. Patience, this is really the idea that we need to stick to the long-term relationships as we engage in these hard issues, that we need to ask the follow-up questions, that when something sounds crazy to us or something bothers us or offends us, that instead of a knee-jerk reaction to critique or to withdraw away or to get angry, can we ask, well, tell me more about why you think that? And you might, through that patient discovery, still conclude at the end of the day, yeah, that still doesn't make any sense to me, but at least you enter in with a posture of thinking, I might be able to learn something new from this person, or we might be able to find some common ground in our disagreement. And then finally, tolerance, the idea that we see, and this point is very deeply Christian, we see in everybody an image bearer. And so we have to do the work of distinguishing people from the ideas that they hold. It doesn't mean we tolerate all ideas everywhere. I hear that a lot in higher ed. Tolerance is only if you fully accept me for everything I am. And that's one, nobody does that. But I mean, if anyone tells me you're completely tolerant of anyone, I'll give you 3 examples of people you don't tolerate. We can go to Nazis and human sacrifice and whatever. So no one tolerates everyone, and that it does mean we should be able to critique ideas, and you don't have to accept them. But we have to push toward a toleration of people, image bearers, and working toward them in relationship across difference.
If they're created in the image of God, and if Christ died for everyone, they can't just be dismissed.
Right. And then I think related to that we can learn from a lot of different people, right? And there's a deeply theological point that God works in the world not just through expressly Christian things, but sometimes from very non-Christian things. So we can see the kingdom of God reflected in different faiths and different arguments and different secular spaces. And this is not sort of a relativism, it's all the same thing. Of course not, but it is to say that sometimes God's truth comes to us, and sometimes prophetically even, from outside of the church. When the church is not doing what it's supposed to do, the rocks will cry out, or analogs to that.
Okay. So natural law or common grace could happen outside of the exclusively Christian environment.
There are parts to that, but I also think formation and what we do and the practices that we have in our gathered worship and our liturgies matter to how we see the world over time. And so at some point, if you're not doing that, then you're actually creating a mindset that makes some of this inaccessible. So I actually think there are some limits to how we engage even in a kind of common grace relationship where people can almost write themselves out of the ability to hear what you're having to say.
Okay. And humility, Lewis said, is not thinking less of yourself, but just thinking about yourself less. Is it a posture where you're saying humility is actually hearing someone else's argument and why they hold it first, before you just vomit your argument and want them to be convinced of it first? Or what?
Yeah, no.
How would you say it?
That's better than I put in the book. So we should
No.
write That's great.
The vomit part, was that what you were talking about?
Absolutely. So I think it's listening to the other side's argument or the other person's argument, but also in the best possible light, so the most charitable version. And this is where, I spend most of my time teaching law students, and one of the things I love about teaching law students is you can't live with the straw man arguments. You're training people to find the best possible version of the other side in order to win, right? In order to knock it down and say why the best version doesn't work. But you're not going to be a good lawyer if you settle for the straw man. And so part of, I think, this humility toward engagement with others is saying, I want to hear your argument, but I want to hear the very best version of your argument. Right. And this translates to culture. I guarantee you the best version of the other side is not on Twitter, right? So you have to do the work to figure out where is the best thinking on these issues.
And Tim Keller in Uncommon Ground would say, Christians, when they're talking about or to opponents, shouldn't do a straw man or a caricature of that argument, the Hindu, the Muslim, the atheist, but give the best representation of the position as if the person would argue it him or herself. They would nod, and then if you need to pick it apart or say, what happens if you hold this all the way to the end, then actually you're starting from a point of common ground, uncommonly common ground.
Right. No, that's exactly right. And I would say when you can root that in an actual human being rather than an abstraction, it becomes much easier to do. So that the argument embodied by my Muslim friend Ibu Patel is not sort of Islam as some category. It's this human being who I know and I care about deeply, and we go on walks and talk about our families, and then we disagree deeply about some of our faith commitments. But my understanding of his arguments is rooted in an actual relationship of trust.
Okay, let's start with America in general. We were founded on some principles of First Amendment speech, or they came in with the amendments. So there's an allowing of assembly, there's allowing of protest, there's allowing of divergent viewpoints. But then those have some limits. So talk about what are the strengths of our founding and our laws that give us a forum for this, and then are those breaking down?
Right.
Or where are they breaking down?
So the backdrop here is that my academic work in graduate school focused in on the First Amendment's right of assembly. And it turned out, when I got into this project, I realized nobody in the country had written about the right of assembly in 40 years. It was in no scholarship. It was in the Supreme Court hadn't touched it. So as a budding graduate student, of course, this is the perfect dissertation topic. And so I wrote quite a bit about the right of assembly. And one of the points I made was when you think about the 5 rights in the First Amendment, speech, press, petition, religion, and assembly, assembly is the only one of those that you can't do alone. I can speak by myself. I can petition the government. Today I can start a website and be the press. In at least some faiths, I can practice religion alone, but there's no way that I can assemble alone. It requires inherently at least one other person. And what that means is somewhere in the very start of the First Amendment, there's this relational component to our civil liberties that suggests we don't just live in society as individuals, but that the groups matter, and then derivative from that, the protections for the groups matter. So we live, you and I are formed by all kinds of thick and thin groups, and we form our beliefs and our identities and our friends, and then over time those groups diverge from one another and they create conflict. And so when we look at the present state of the country. We've got lots of conflicting groups, and the First Amendment says those groups need protections, meaningful protections. And then the question is, how do you do that? The other interesting point about the First Amendment is that the right of assembly is the only right that is qualified by an adverb, which is peaceable. So assembly is only protected if it's peaceable assembly, which is great news for the church because we wouldn't want to be unpeaceable in what we do. But so there are, as we look about sort of conflicts and challenges today, there are limits to non-peaceable assemblies, but outside of those limits, the right to gather, the right to protest, the right to agitate and make even decision makers very uncomfortable is pretty broad. And really where the law is today, more often than not, local states and municipalities over-police the right of assembly. So in other words, your protest rights are not typically as strong as they should be. And usually when I'm giving a law-based talk, I'll say, throw out the issue that you care about, and I can point to somewhere in the country where people who care about that issue are trying to protest and are getting shut down by government authorities. So it's not an ideological point.
So there's overreach, perhaps.
Overreach for everyone, and
Yes.
this is and the answer is that people should care about these rights to protect our own ways of life and our right, but also those of the people we disagree with, because that's the only way it works.
So I want freedom of speech and assembly to get out my positions, but not necessarily the position that is abhorrent to me. But it only works, assembly and speech, if the abhorrent can be allowed to be shared, if it's peaceable. That's
right. And I think increasingly, optimistically, people are starting to get this. I wrote a brief to the Supreme Court a couple of years ago, and I represented the Southern Baptists, the Mormons, the Hare Krishnas, the Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Conference of Catholic Bishops. So,
and the Harley Davidson bikers.
Right. They all it might as well have been, right? And those five don't agree about much, but they all agree that it was very important to protect this right to protest.
Okay.
And that's a good demonstration of where things should
So during COVID-19 in California, some churches weren't allowed to assemble, and John MacArthur's church, for instance, said, we're going to protest that. In Texas, Abbott said, we're not going to have that restriction, so we had more permissiveness. How can the states either assist in helping that, or where do they get in the way with the federal? How is that all aligned or in conflict with each other?
That's a very complex question.
You've got 1 minute.
Yeah. In that case, I should just tweet something. It's a great set of issues you've just named in the question. It's extremely complicated by different states and local governments, what their laws are on religious freedom, which are not all the same across the country.
Right.
It's complicated on where the pandemic was at any given time of the last few years.
Could there be a public health override of certain rights in the short term?
Yeah, the answer is yes, for sure, because no right is unlimited. And in my view, there were certainly times during the pandemic when the public health override absolutely necessitated legally closing some churches, including, I wrote a piece in The Atlantic, the title of which was Close the Churches, which was not popular with a lot of Christians. But it was a serious point that at a certain point in the pandemic, when we had very limited knowledge, and officials in good faith were saying, we have to make some decisions now. And I started the piece by saying, and let's just name what a huge deal this is, right? For people of all faiths, this is not kind of a choice whether you go to church. It's a command and an obligation. So the stakes are extremely high. But I was telling someone 6 months later, if they'd asked me again, I would have written the piece that said open the churches, because there was overreach, and there are very few clean hands in terms of the policy stuff at this stage of the pandemic. And
so at that moment, you thought that was how we loved our neighbor as ourselves.
Right.
But a later date, we maybe love our neighbor as ourselves in a different way.
Right. Barth said that the fundamental freedom the church must have is the freedom to preach the gospel. And so at any time that the state comes in effect, prohibiting the church from preaching the gospel, then I think the church is at that point commanded to a form of civil disobedience. And, there were certainly moments in the last couple of years where people started to think, are we headed that way, and depending on where you were in the country. But the other point here is if you feel compelled theologically to something like civil disobedience, then count the costs and actually do it, right? Don't just kind of ignore things and pretend like they don't exist out there. Don't be unwilling to take the costs. And so I think this question of neighbor love that should inform all of our actions, whether it's a kind of resistance or a compliance, should be in the midst of our decisions.
And this peaceably assemble
Yeah.
or peaceably speak, then that comes into the very controversial January 6th event. And then now with the leak of the potential Roe v. Wade, certain people coming to justices' houses that either were just going to hold a sign in silence, or some that wanted to break windows and take people captive, almost, and everything in between. So some of our parties would take a stronger or a weaker stance on each of those at certain times. And so how do we have a way forward even on those issues? Because you'll have accusations of Antifa in Portland or St. Louis doing Molotov cocktails into federal buildings.
Right.
And you'll have other people just standing silently and protesting peaceably.
Right.
We need to have the peaceable. How can we consistently, whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent or whatever, counter the violent or the expressive that impinges on somebody else's existence or safety?
Can we go back to questions about my family and just some more?
Well, and when you did your article on Close the Churches, if you got a tweet that was negative about that, which I'm sure you did, and some positive, that's one thing. Someone showing up at your house or threatening your kids, that's a whole nother
No, that's
matter.
right. Yeah, sure. So starting with the law point, the laws and the peaceably part of the law is actually quite clear here. So if you engage in actual or imminent law breaking, it doesn't even have to be violent, then you're outside the proper boundaries of protection. So if you're doing a protest and you decide we're going to take the streets and shut down the highway, at that point, you're breaking the law, and the authorities have every right to come in and shut you down. Now, in the best cases, protesters will talk to local authorities and in advance say, here's what we're going to do. This is actually how some of the big
Some
civil
ground
rights
rules.
protests, we're going to formally break the law, engage in this act of civil disobedience, shut down the street, and the police will support that up to a point, and then they'll say, time's over, we need cars coming through. And so the protest moment is demonstrated. It is technical law breaking, but the authorities are actually in conversation with the protesters. And so actually what's super interesting about that example is there is a kind of trust built in even to these adversarial relationships. Now when protests, which sometimes happen spontaneously, don't do that, then it's a matter of law enforcement discretion how long they want to allow an assembly that has turned non-peaceable to go on. The problem here is the law is not very good at instructing officers about when they can and should intervene. And I've worked with different protesters who've been arrested and charged, and often it turns out that the necessary predicates for the charge weren't even there. So it's hard, but my brother's a police officer. I feel for the officers in the moment when, within a matter of seconds, something that's very vanilla and mundane can turn into something very violent and dangerous. So these are hard for a reason, and there's a lot to work out there. Now, protests in front of the houses of Supreme Court justices, the law is pretty clear there that private residences should be off limits. I mean, you can still be on the streets, but the idea we have to, in all, I think, regardless of political party or ideology, we have to protect private spaces for people, even public officials, to be people with their families and with their neighbors. And that's a norm that is, I think, under tremendous strain right now and that we need to pay attention to.
Now, if you're a Christian, often we devolve into kind of three approaches. One is, I'm just going to disengage from public life completely because I will be misrepresented or yelled at or called horrible names. So I'm just not going to go there. Or some that want to be in the fray and they'll go toe-to-toe yelling with the counter people on the other side. Is there a third way?
There's a third way. You can buy it
That
on
was a
Amazon.
softball that
Yes.
I threw to you for you to hit.
We're back to the no. But I want to highlight the options that you gave, because sometimes, and plenty of Christians will come up to me and say, I don't like your argument. I don't agree that we need to take risks with our neighbors who aren't like us. And so I'll usually say, okay, well, what is the alternative then, right? If it takes a theory to beat a theory, tell me what you want to do with your family and your community for the next 20, 30, whatever, however much you have left on the earth. And so the withdraw option, which some people argue for, seems to me ultimately to be not a form of plausible politics. Politics is the engagement with people in a common community, and if you're just going to go off and be by yourselves, you're not doing politics. Now, there might be, there are periods of time in the church where parts of the church were called to go be in cloistered communities and be by themselves for a reason. So if there's a vocational call to do that, then I certainly want to affirm that. But for most of us in this country today, given how interconnected we are, given where our money goes and the things we buy and where we work and where we live, that's not an option for us. So we're called to be in the midst of people. So then option 2 is try to take over and win at any cost. And there are a lot of people, including just in the past 2 weeks, a lot of people have gone after my co-author Tim Keller and have said, your way of doing things, it might have worked back then, but now we need to fight. We need to, this is high stakes, win or lose, and we need to fight. And I don't know, when I hear it's very hard for me to understand how you situate that position with the call of the gospel. The New Testament was written to a group of people who were under deep oppression, and the counsel to them was not fight at all costs. The counsel to them was to exhibit the fruits of the Spirit and love their neighbor and love God and persevere. And so I think for Christians in this society, we're called to be in the midst of it. We're called to live faithfully. So that does mean this isn't sort of surrender your convictions, never speak up for truth. It does mean some prudence and discernment of when to do that. And I think we've got so many amazing models around the world of Christians in far more dire circumstances than we will likely ever encounter, who don't always get to say, this is what I think about your bad view, but sometimes they do. And when they can discern through the Spirit of when to talk and also when not to talk, I think that's a way in which we can find encouragement from one another. The problem now is there are too many Christians in this country who just always are sensing that they are being called to talk and say things over and over.
Right. And if we're no different than the people that we're confronting in the way we live our lives, that's not a Christian witness, perhaps.
Right.
What they were attacking Keller about was the winsome witness approach from the past won't work in today's divisiveness. And they said when you started at Redeemer in New York City, it was neutral Christianity, not negative. And Keller had to come back and said, when I started in New York, it was negative.
That's right.
And I was attacked a lot, and there was opposition. There was some suffering to my position. But Scripture, and this is in Uncommon Ground, where you got the idea for tolerance and humility and patience was from Ephesians 4, which says, walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, showing tolerance for one another in love. And that was at a time when if Paul would have gone into the theater in Ephesus, he might have been killed because he spoke out about the silversmiths and it was hurting their business about idolatry. So sometimes the Christian message caused opposition in the polis, the city, and it was not easy to be Christian.
Right. And this also ties to something you said a minute ago on the critics of Keller who would say this won't work, but that's not a theological category of making things work, right? We're called to faithfulness.
To be faithful.
And we're called to a consistent presence. And then what happens, and this is where, I was talking with the Pelops last night about this, but we have this, I think, peculiar Americanized Christian vision where our sense of what works or our cycles of hope are around election cycles or when you're funding a new project, what's the 1-year return on investment? And that kind of thinking is just so foreign to
or the short term
to this whole story of Scripture. And so what my friend Andy Crouch has recently pointed out in Exodus, God says, first of all, I will carry the sins of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generations. So that's dire and sad and also probably true from much of our lived experience when we think about 3 to 4 generations ago. But the next verse in Exodus is, but for those who love me and obey my commands, I will give my blessings to 1,000 generations. And the point there is, let's be 1,000 generation people who are not, things might feel bad next Tuesday or next year, or when our candidate doesn't win, or when some new policy seems challenging, but the person who's thinking about 1,000 of generations for the kingdom of God is not going to be concerned about.
Haul. Yeah. I've said in a couple sermons or teachings about Alan Kreider's book, The Patient Ferment of the Early Church, where he looks historically at the first 3 centuries and what actually got the Greco-Roman world's attention. And it wasn't treatises on evangelism, why the church grew. And it wasn't disengagement. It wasn't enmeshment. It was being in the midst of and yet unique. Mm-hmm. And that many of the people in Africa, in Turkey, in Rome, in Palestine wrote about patience. That somehow being gracious to people who didn't deserve graciousness because Christ died on the cross, saying, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they do. That was the thing that people said, I'm not like that. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That got their attention. And then how they treated women, how they treated orphans, how they started hospitals when everybody else would go to the villas when there was a pandemic, they would stay and serve, even if it cost them in their life. So this love of God, love of their neighbor, and the way they engaged others was a unique posture.
And I think part of that posture is also, and part of that patience is not always feeling the need to stand up for your own rights or your own reputation when they are attacked or maligned, as they will be. So, of course, law is important. I believe in the law. I teach the law. I want the law to be done well. I want Christians working toward just laws. But every time you feel personally an attack, either to the church or to your individual person, there's not necessarily a formula that says you have to push back or yell back or defend yourself. And this is one of the things I've learned doing a lot of public writing. I receive lots of unsolicited comments from people who are sometimes very angry, and it's a discipline to say, I don't need to answer that, I don't need to respond. Maybe I am being maligned, but that's not part of patience is just letting that go.
Jesus at his trial said very few things.
Yeah.
Now let me jump really into the deep end and go from preaching to meddling. What I hear from members that have kids in junior high and high school is often my kids don't share the same positions politically or religiously as I do, and we're at odds. Maybe it's over an election. I'm going to vote for this person. I'm going to vote for someone else, or I'm going to vote and they're not going to vote. Or I hear a lot from more senior adults, my grown children, when we are together for Thanksgiving or Christmas. It is very, very difficult right now to get into substantive discussions on the topics that really matter. Give us some help there.
No one has any concerns about this, right, in your own lives? No, this is a huge issue, and I do think the opportunity, especially for Christians and for the church, is we have among us one of the best possible resources in intergenerational friendship and relationship, and there are very few institutions left today where that can actually happen. So it's a big if right now, but if we could do the hard work of connecting an 80-year-old with a 14-year-old, and also I'm at this point convinced that successful youth ministry will require adults other than parents to be involved in the lives of kids. So if we can do that, the more that we model a beautiful community that is intergenerational and interfamily, the more we set the conditions to work through. And some of that might mean that the 40-year-old mentor to my 15-year-old daughter can actually speak into her life better than I can, or she'll listen
certain
more
moments.
at certain moments.
Lilly Foundation did a study that said the greatest indicator of health going into adulthood was 5 to 7 non-exploitive adults other than the parents in your child's life. Could be an aunt, could be an uncle, it just could be brothers and sisters in the faith who take their stories seriously, earn the right to be heard, and then out of that, share their convictions humbly.
That's right. Yeah, and then to get there, we've got to do the work of recognizing that there's a tremendous amount of wisdom and experience and compassion and love in the people in this room from different generations. And you have to get past your generational distrust and just your basic unfamiliarity with ages. When I was a college kid, I remember showing up at Blacknall Presbyterian in Durham and seeing these, 40-somethings with their kids, and I would just sit there and think, why aren't these people coming up to say hi to me? Because here I am, just the college kid, and they're obviously the people embedded in the church, and I feel awkward. And now that I'm that person with the kids, I see the college kids at my church, and I think, why aren't those cool college kids coming up to say hi to me? Because I feel awkward.
It's on somebody else.
So it's always on
their
somebody.
responsibility.
Right, but those are the kinds of things that, and then I think also a kind of, I think we need to rethink what collective commitment to the witnessing church looks like. So when I was a youth pastor, I had all these parents coming to me, and they were worried about their kids getting into all these bad things. And I said, after thinking about it a while, I said, I think the greatest challenge to your kids' faith is not sex, it's not drugs, it's youth soccer. And what I meant by that was all of these, and I'm a parent too, guilty as charged. I want my kids to be in these things, but we have such a premium commitment to all these other things outside of the church that demand of our kids actual allegiance. You've got to be here. You have to prioritize this.
It's a rival religion at times.
It can become that, and then the church, which is at this stage, and we just want will someone come and like us and be part of our youth group? And so we set the bar low when instead maybe we should set the bar high. And I don't have the perfect solution here, but one thing I did in youth ministry because I had done it after practicing law, I had some skill sets that I could use. So we had the Sunday night youth group where you sang the songs and played the games, and everyone could come to that. But then we had the opt-in discipleship group midweek.
Going deeper
with scripture and together and prayer. And what I said was, if you don't have to come to this, but if you want to come to this, you have to sign a contract. And I wrote up a legal contract for the students to sign. And the contract said, if your sports practice gets scheduled on Wednesday nights, you tell your coach you got to come to discipleship group. And if you have a test on Thursday morning that you haven't studied for, you have to come to discipleship group. And I laid out, these are the competing priorities in your life, and for this commitment, you have to choose this one. And then I made a parallel contract and made the parents sign it. And that was even the harder sell and signature.
But we reap what we sow, and what we put in, we get back out, and a low investment, a low return.
The aim high in some cases, it wasn't for everyone, but there's a group of kids now in their late 20s who look back at that season and think, that was deeply formative because it was you required something different.
Good. In the chapter that you did in Uncommon Ground, you talked about your role as a translator. Mm-hmm. And I'm doing a 3-week series on Lost in Translation, taking some Hebrew words and updating those for us today. But there are some conversation stopper words that I think you talk about that are things like when we're talking to a family member, a parent, a child, a neighbor, someone in conversation in our city, if we say they are closed-minded, extremists, heretical, bigoted, militant, Nazi, fascist, racist, we're done. Mm-hmm. What are conversation starter as opposed to stopper questions or comments to someone?
Yeah, that's a great way to flip it. I think the often it's the question rather than the comment. So it's tell me more about that, and actually body language matters here too. So when you hear something, I think especially when you're going into a relationship with someone who's different than you, can you say a little prayer right before the conversation, like, Lord, do not make me get big-eyed when I hear that comment for the first time.
You said what?
Right, yes, right, yeah.
You believe what?
I'm a very bad eye roller, so I sometimes have to train myself not to do that.
Junior high and high schoolers, you were in youth ministry, so you got that pretty good.
Yes. So I do. So can we go into these conversations with an empathy and a body posture even that says, I want to hear, even like when we're talking to one another, if we're, this is not very invitational,
Sitting
and this
back
is more, what can I hear? How can I learn from you? And then I think to admit that we don't know everything, that it's okay to say, I don't understand what you're talking about, or maybe I need to go read more about that. You know, especially when you get to a really complex political issue over which there's massive disagreement. It's very seldom the case that two people having that discussion are fully informed by all the right sources, right? So it's very likely that there are massive knowledge gaps in the midst of that conversation. So when you have that conversation, unless you happen to be the world's expert on this particular topic, when you hear a position challenging yours, maybe instead of saying, no, that's not right because so-and-so said so, it's, well, tell me where you heard that. I'd love to read more about it. I'd love to, you know, that doesn't fit with my understanding of the debate, but I'd like to learn more.
I want to open it up to the audience for the last kind of 10, 15 minutes in just a moment. So anybody that wants to ask a question would come to the mic there, or we can pass it around. But before I do that, I wanted to say if we share our side, when we say our side, our conviction, what really matters to us, I've heard that if you can do it from a position of what you're afraid of by the other position, this is what scares me about where you're coming from, or this is my fear regarding your position. And then you can own your why. What is your why behind the position you hold? Those two things can help a dialogue not close it off. So here's what scares me to death about what you just said. If we go down this way, I think society falls apart completely, or the family no longer functions, or no one would get a job, or violence would reign in our society. That's what scares me. And they might say, that scares me too. And I'll go, I didn't know we had that in common. And then you've got something. And if I don't know the why behind my position, I probably should develop that. Mm-hmm. If I'm pro-life around abortion, I should have a why behind that. If I'm for all books being read at young ages in our city, or some books being removed right now from public schools because it's too early for that conversation, I should have a why behind that. And I should look for or listen for the why in somebody else's position. They maybe have been wounded, or they've maybe thought about it from their posture as well. React to that one way or another.
That's great. And I think the part of the looking for, especially that point about what's the fear, or what's, if you can ask the question in a way that invites an honest response, especially with a lot of people who are either not Christians or no longer in the church, the fear or the hurt is out of a deep wound from Christians or from the church, which then leads to again, instead of a defensive, well, that's not how Christians are, or you got us wrong. It's actually, well, let's talk about how because Christians have done some very terrible things to a lot of people, and it hasn't been much better in the last few years. And I think to acknowledge that, to own kind of our own problems institutionally and then as people, and then
give away that ground that we can't defend. If that's what it's saying.
That's right. Yeah.
There was someone who wasn't saying they were deconstructing, but that's a common phrase these days. They were going through great questions about faith and church, and can I be part of Christianity going forward? And they just said, I can't do it anymore, and I don't believe in a God like that. And I said, tell me about the God you don't believe in. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And they said, well, I don't believe in a God who's angry at everybody and is judging everybody, and I don't believe in this, and gave like 10 things, and I said, I don't believe in that God either.
Right.
And they said, what? I said, I believe fundamentally in a God that created us not out of need, but out of love. I believe Christ died for everybody on the cross. I believe we're to love God and our neighbor as ourselves. I don't believe in a bigoted God that wants you to hate everybody. That's a place to start. Mm-hmm. So find out where they're coming from, I think really, really matters. Is there anybody that wants to come with questions? I can keep talking for a while, but I think it'd be much more interesting if we get people from the floor that had. Sarah, do you want to be the first to do that? And I didn't prompt this, even though sometimes if no one is going to say anything, Sarah's on our staff with young adults, and Dan is on our staff with Alpha and Evangelism. So,
yeah,
great.
I get in these public spaces a lot because we run a podcast, and I'm constantly having conversations around politics and these kinds of things. And I think my question for you is about sort of where the line is with this word I'm about to say, which when it gets thrown at you, I don't know how you come back from it. and the word is harmful. I feel like, especially just to give sort of a platform, the gender ideology argument. If you want to speak with conviction about that, and you use the most love and the most grace, the most patience, humility, but you stand with conviction about what you think is right and sort of the created order, there's no coming back from someone saying, well, that's harmful. We're beyond intolerant. Like, well, what you're saying, and even having a conversation about it is creating a harmful space. How do you, from there, I don't know where to go. I mean, our
That's
podcast.
a conversation stopper when someone says,
Yeah.
you've harmed me.
But I think it's important, and so I'm like, well, especially as a mom, too. It's not just as a podcast, I mean, whatever. But as a mom with kids in school, and this is a constant conversation, I feel like we have to speak with conviction. But how do you do that when you're labeled? We've been labeled a hate group, too, so that's fun. But how do you respond to that?
Right. Well, I do think this is all over the place. That this harms me, or I'm no longer safe in your presence because of what you said. So I think two things. One, it is sometimes important to point out an abuse of language, or I mean, sometimes those words are used just to score a point, or deliberately as a conversation stopper. They're trying to stigmatize the person on the other side by saying, you're harming me or you're keeping me unsafe. So that's point one, which requires discernment of when to know when that happens. Sometimes an individual person actually feels harmed or unsafe. And I would probably start there, like, who is the speaker? And if there's a chance that this actual person feels unsafe, whether it's justified or not, the subjective experience of feeling unsafe or harmed or marginalized is enough, I think, for a Christian to say, let me start, before we get into the argument or discussion, let me start by asking you what that feels like and how can I be helpful to you in that moment. Yeah. And then the next step, if they're ready to have the next conversation, is more of a philosophical point, but that harm and safety, by their nature, are subjectively experienced, by which I mean anything. I mean, I could open up the dictionary and point to a word and say the word, and it's possible that that word could harm somebody in this room based on your life experiences, based on something I don't know about you, and there's no possible way that you can actually avoid subjectively experienced harm in a society, because we're all feeling it. I mean, you might be harming me by how close you're sitting next to me. Who knows, right? And I don't want to, but there might be a person who actually subjectively, interpersonally experiences that. So as a policy matter, how do you resolve the many different ways people experience harm and threat to safety? Well, you have to have a baseline that says, and the baseline in this country is often, and I think rightfully so, that words alone are not going to, they might subjectively cause you to feel unsafe. You might think that's harm, but your subjective experience is not going to be able to limit the discussion. So we have to train each other to have hard conversations and to feel harmed within them, and to know that we are still physically safe after them, and to know it's going to be hard.
So if somebody stands and towers over, that could be intimidation.
Sure, yeah, that's a different...
posturing. But if you're just having a conversation, that's a way out if you say, I'm feeling now unsafe. I saw this week, Candace Owen, very conservative black woman, went to a Black Lives Matter mansion and wanted just to talk to the owner. The owner posted on Twitter that she was feeling harmed and cried, but they taped the entire showing of Candace Owens at that gate. And so the woman took down her, I felt harmed and I was subjected to unsafeness there, because the objective evidence was Candace didn't do that. Now, the hard is the in-between. When you're having a conversation, something you said or the intensity of your voice, you don't even know how passionate you are in the argument. My wife grew up in a family that if there was disagreement, everybody went to their room. And then in a week, you didn't talk about it anymore. In my family, the aunts and the uncles and my mother, it's Norwegian, but it's Italian. They're going at it. And the first time she was in a conversation where that happened, she said, do all your family members hate each other? No, we love each other, but they're going to go at it and talk. And she had to realize she was at a very different context than her family. And so are there ways that we can put ground rules before something starts that says just saying thing in this conversation we can't say is harm. And we maybe have to develop that legal criteria or something.
Or just a norm of your community that says this is how we're going to be together. But in that, also recognizing that words do actually harm people. One of the biggest lies is we all learn sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Words, of course, hurt you, right? I'm still wounded by things people said to me when I was 9, right? I mean, this is why a lot of us still go to counseling. So, the words can hurt, but it's very important as a society to distinguish hurt and subjective harm from where you can't have a conversation that causes
some
that.
people on very different positions have decided to try to engage these dialogues. In the book, it talks about Jerry Falwell and Larry Flynn doing that. They became friends, exchanged Christmas cards. About Loretta Wagner and B.J. Isaacson Jones, the Jack Danforth story. And then right now, is it George Roberts at Princeton, who's very conservative, and then who's the
Robbie George and Cornel West.
Cornel West, who's very liberal. One's white, one's black, and they've decided to be in dialogue with each other about the most controversial, hot-button issues because of their fundamental respect of each other. But that has not been easy for them over the years. But they've made a commitment to that and tried to overcome when they've probably felt at times harmed, if that's the way to talk about it.
Right. Well, in all three of those examples, they began in friendships rooted in trust that allowed them to be more public in the display of their disagreement. And that's the only way to make those sorts of situations work.
Right. And if Christians are not going to on some of these tough issues, because in MDPC there would be people who are not voting, but would maybe vote because of their Christian convictions Democratic. Some would vote Republican because of their Christian convictions, or Libertarian or whatever. If we can't have these conversations around elections, etc., who's going to do it? Who's going to model it?
Right, because as we say in Uncommon Ground, we have not only humility, patience, and tolerance, but the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love that sustain us, or should sustain us even more in those.
Right. Somehow the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ should be an umbrella larger than those political differences.
Right, yeah.
Dan, are you ready to?
If there are non-staff,
Is there a non-staff? Yes, let's start with Eric.
I'm kind of a pseudo-staff.
Is everybody in here on the staff?
Former Marine, seven members in the congregation, 70 members in the congregation over the years. So,
Right.
Eric.
So your observation about being a college kid going to church and then being a parent going to church and how you felt differently or felt the same in that, I think there's an excellent exercise in that for all of us to kind of track when we feel maligned today, write it down, journal it, whatever, and then look at that later in life and see if you're doing the same thing that you felt maligned about later in life. I had a situation in college where in our sophomore year, everybody was all upset about something, and I wrote down a list of what we were upset about. Junior year, I went back and read the list to my classmates, and they were not upset about it anymore, and they were doing the exact same thing that they were upset about the year before.
It was a passing fad, not a enduring issue.
Well, it was class structure in our organization, but it's a good example or a good exercise for all of us to think about what is life like and how are we feeling maligned today, and how are we then doing the same thing to other people later in our life? And maybe we should think about that a little more.
I like that. The one other thought that calls to mind is there's an asymmetry often in experiences where, so back to my example, when I was the college kid, I didn't know what it was like to be the 45-year-old parent. But when I was the 45-year-old parent, or am, I do know what it was like to be the college kid. So maybe the burden is a little more on me to realize I've been in both situations, and that might have resonance for other disagreements or.
Kristen.
Okay, so growing up, when I was formed as an evangelical college student and young adult, the emphasis on conversations with non-believers was often towards trying to bring them to our point of view. Okay, so I'm wondering if that is maybe not the point as much as what I'm hearing, but the point is how we handle ourselves in those conversations or the relationship that's being formed. Is there a way that you might offer like a word of liberty to our Christian spirit, that we might not be achieving what we once thought we were supposed to achieve? Are we achieving something different? Is there a different like goal or outcome or metric that we could not feel like we have maybe not done what we thought we were supposed to do?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's a great question. I think the end purpose to which we are called remains the same, right? To go and make disciples of all nations. So there is, nothing has changed about our responsibility to be the people of God in the kingdom of God and to make disciples, and so that's still there. But I do think, especially in churches today, we need to give each other a whole lot more grace in the different vocational lanes and contexts to which we are called. So I sometimes, one of the critiques I don't love that I sometimes get is when some Christians will ask me, why don't you say more about the gospel in your law school classes? And my answer is, I teach at an elite non-Christian university. Like, that would be malpractice for me to start my criminal law class with a gospel presentation. But what I do is I try to demonstrate the way that I live my life, and then I try to find the Christian students around me, and then we talk about Christian formation and discipleship. And then to the non-Christians, I invite them for conversations to hear how life is different. But it does mean, sometimes there are people who are called to be evangelists who expressly walk up. I had a long-standing debate with a college buddy because he would always get on an airplane and his goal was to evangelize the person next to him. And I'm going to just confess, I get on an airplane, put in my headphones, and start working. The last thing I want to do is talk to the person next to me because that's going to be time to work so I can be with my kids. And so if he's sort of vocationally called to share the gospel with his seatmate, then I think that's great. And if I'm actually not talking to my seatmate because I'm on the way to come talk to a group of Christians or whatever it is, then there's also, I think, a role for me. And then to open ourselves up to challenge and when we're erring too much.
I love, John, you saying the Great Commission is still the goal, but Don Everts, who we've read some books on, that he says the 5 thresholds 30 years ago maybe, if you removed one reasonable objection to the faith, they would believe in Jesus. Oh, if I can know that Jesus rose from the dead, I'm there. But according to Everts on college campuses today, the first question is, do I know a Christian who I trust, who I respect? That's threshold 1. So it's threshold 3 or 4 or 5 to get to the reasonable objections. And so with the secularization of society, do they have any Christians who have fruit in their life that they want to emulate or that they respect? And so that's a challenge for all of us. Other questions? Dan, you ready? Last one? Anybody else? I see
You've got 7 seconds.
some people starting to go down the hallway, so we'll wrap it up in short order.
My first question was actually going to be related to conversation with LGBTQ community, but she kind of took that one. So I think another question that I think is valuable too is, can you give us some helpful, maybe self-evaluative questions that would reveal where we still need to be formed by Jesus in order to have these productive, see, that's an American way of putting that,
More faithful conversations.
helpful conversations around these tough issues with people who don't believe like us.
So off the cuff, how much time are you spending on your phone? What news sources do you read and listen to? What books have you read in the last year? What does your friend group look like at the level of closest 5 to 10 and then maybe 20 to 30? And if they all think and talk and look like you, then how do you maybe think about changing that? Where are you spending your money? I could go on for a while, right? But I really do think it comes down to very practical discipleship-related pieces. Because really, especially the moment we're in, where things feel very tense and very fractured, not just outside of churches, but inside of churches, this is fundamentally a question of discipleship. And the discipleship is not simply about coming here and listening to a sermon on Sunday mornings, but it's about what's on your phone, what's going into your mind, the other waking hours of your day. And if you don't, if that discipleship issue isn't addressed head on, it's going to be very hard for even the best preacher to bring it home once a week on Sundays.
And even the not best preachers to do that. Well, and in Jesus' original 12, they didn't come from the same political agendas, the same towns, the same ethos. Jesus had to work very hard among the 12 for them to love each other well. I mean, you had zealots trying to overthrow Rome. You had 2 or 3 in league with Rome, tax collectors, etc. And then you had people from the north and the south. You had fishermen, more uneducated, and you had highly educated. And so Jesus took a group not that dissimilar to an MDPC or other churches around the country, and as him as the head, there was hope. And without him as the head, I think we're all in a big deal of trouble. We got to stop there, but you'll want to get more involved in this if the conversation was interesting, in Uncommon Ground, Living Faithfully in a World of Difference, and then Confident Pluralism, John Inazu, and hopefully you'll be this afternoon at Kincaid or tonight at the Racket Club to hear more. Would you join me in thanking you?
Thank you. Thanks, Al.